Okay, so first things first. I make an active effort to keep things positive on this channel. Until now, I've only talked about stuff I like and why I like said stuff. Maybe some minor criticisms here and there, mostly for comedic effect, but nothing major. I do this because I don't want to turn into yet another nostalgia critic type guy. While I don't pretend to be a saint online, we all know this kind of angry reviewer content can and often is very entertaining, I actually think that, in the long term, this type of content can be very damaging, toxic, and oftentimes just plain mean to a bunch of people that did nothing to deserve so many roastings and communities dedicated to hating them and what they do. And truth be told, do we seriously need more negativity on the internet? However, as you've surely guessed by the title or thumbnail, today's subject matter will surely ruffle some feathers, not least of which my own. I will inevitably end up calling some people out, getting very political, obviously, and saying quite a few harsh things at certain groups of people. Because that's just something that has been living rent-free in my mind, and I need to get it off my chest so I stop flooding comment sections with huge texts nobody will ever read. That said, depending on your, shall we say, profile, you may already be pissed at the very premise of this video. If that's the case, I kindly ask you to please give me a chance. Try to watch the whole thing. I swear I'm trying here to be as fair and reasonable as possible. So at the very least, let me make my case and approach this with an open mind. Now, if you happen to fall into another kind of profile which uses, say, hashtag Team Eren unironically among other less savory hashtags, then I'm sorry, at some point I will harshly criticize you. You probably won't be open-minded anyway, and this video is likely not for you. Truth be told, I'm actually kinda terrified to release this video. I know this is a small YouTube channel and it probably won't blow up, but you know, this topic tends to get heated and I'm not sure I want or can deal with it. Still, I guess I just really need to do this. There, all cards on the table. We good? Okay, on with the video. Oh yeah, obviously spoilers for the whole thing, no way around those. Oh, also, I'm anime only, that's why this video is only releasing now. So, Attack on Titan. I don't think it really needs much introduction, right? A manga created by Hajime Isayama that exploded in popularity back in 2013. When the first season of its anime adaptation aired, this is the sort of work that even those generally unaware about anime have at the very least heard the name in passing somehow. The first OP fucking slaps. It became a meme. Here's a few of my favorites. As is usual with anything that becomes hugely popular to the point of becoming quote-unquote mainstream, at some point pushback from contrarians begins to turn up, saying it's overrated, overblown, not that good, and actually fascist. Wait, what? Yeah, in case you couldn't tell already, this is what this video will be about. Attack on Titan at some point began to be accused of actually being low-key fascist, racist, anti-Semitic, promoting Japanese nationalism, and other such fare. Over time, this narrative became so big that it permeated discourse over this work to such an extent that it turned into one of those situations where your general character is in question when you mention you like it. Content creators, I'm assuming here, let me clarify, begin to shy away from discussing it because things tend to get really heated, weird rumors start making the rounds, and unambiguously awful people begin to further fuck up the discussion until it all turns into a shit show where people are generally on guard for toxicity whenever it comes up. Here's the thing, AOT is so clearly, obviously, unambiguously not fascist that I'm just straight up flabbergasted this narrative has become so entrenched into conversations and publications at all. But wait, before you go, here's another thing. There are also understandable, dare I say genuinely concerning reasons for this response. Nothing is simple, everything is complicated, and on this video I will make my case as to why Attack on Titan is obviously not fascistic or very problematic at all, but also how this narrative came to be, who and what perpetrates it, why it can be at least a little concerning, and generally saying people should just chill the fuck out and take a look at what the story is actually saying to all of our faces. But in order to do that, we gotta start at the main reason why people's eyebrows collectively began to raise in the first place. I'm sure about 99% of people watching this video know this already, but here's a, I swear, quick recap. The premise of Attack on Titan is that of a world where humanity lives enclosed within 3 sets of large walls in fear of titans. Gigantic, creepy beings that roam around the outside of the city and are fond of eating humans alive. Humanity outside the walls has perished but has found peace and stability in their current predicament. Our protagonist is Eren Jaeger, a boy who finds his life inside the walls to be limiting and demeaning, dreaming with his best pal Armin of one day reconquering the outside world and exploring all the supposedly beautiful and inconceivable landscapes it reserves. The story starts as the first wall is broken by a huge titan for the first time in over 100 years, and Eren helplessly watches his mom getting chomped alive by one of the many titans who got into the city via the recently made gaping hole in its defense, all the while his dad has disappeared and left him with a key to his old basement. Most of the series from then on is concerned with the escalating threat of titans encroaching upon the city structure, how to actually counter them, the internal political machinations within the government of humanity's last bastion, and occasionally someone remembers they should probably hit that basement at some point. A lot of it gives off a pretty big nationalistic vibe, let's put a pin on that. There's a bunch of twists and turns along the way, one of the most important being that Eren here can turn into a titan, which suggests other humans also can. And they do. Turns out these 3 characters, Reiner, Berthold, and Annie, are actually traitors capable of turning into titans. Not only that, Reiner and Berthold are the so-called armored and colossal titans, the very same who broke the wall way back in the first episode, and are working from within for some sort of agenda they just never fully reveal. Plus, Eren seems to have some sort of special power they call the Coordinate, and there's this furry titan causing all sorts of mayhem. After a whopping 57 episodes, they finally get to the basement, and it's one of those magical moments in media where you think, after all this hype, there's no way the revelation will actually live up to it, and oh boy was it earth-shattering. In the history of Attack on Titan, there was once a nation that went by the name of Eldia. Ymir, an Eldian of legend, could turn into a titan and bestowed said power unto her people, springing not only the common type of titan we see during the series, but also 9 special ones: Founding, Armored, Attack, Beast, Cart, Colossus, Female, Jaw, and Warhammer titans. Eldia used this power to violently build a blood-soaked empire. At some point, the at-the-time oppressed nation of Marley managed to seize control of 7 of the 9 special titans during the Great Titan War, and managed to subdue Eldia almost completely. Almost, because then Eldia King Karl Fritz, having inherited the founding titan, managed to flee with some of his people to a small island called Paradise, where he used his power to turn many of his subjects into several colossal titans in order to build the walls, and then erased all of their memories so that they could isolate themselves from conflict by feeding the lie that humanity was long gone outside their walls. Marley then built a blood-soaked empire of its own, using captured Eldians they kept in ghettos as second-class citizens, another pin here, to exploit the power of titans as tools of war to subjugate other nations. By injecting titan spinal fluid into Eldians, they could get them to transform into pure titans, the ones that are unintelligent and just roam about eating people. Not keen on letting those 2 types of special titans they didn't have go, they began operations to invade Paradise and recover both the Founding and Attack Titan. The way these special titans work is that they can be inherited from person to person, should the current owner of a titan be eaten alive by a recently transformed Eldian. Turns out Grisha, Eren's father, was an Eldian living in Marley who joined the resistance movement, was ratted out by his own son, Zeke, and sent to Paradise in order to be transformed into one of the countless pure titans that Marley lets loose around the island as punishment. Due to circumstances, Grisha inherited the Attack Titan, later on the Founding Titan as well, and then he passed both of them to his new son with his new wife on Paradise, Eren. Sometime after that, Zeke inherited the Beast Titan, and those 3 traitors I mentioned were shown to be Eldians who were given a chance to become honorary Marleyans by inheriting the other special titans, becoming Marleyan soldiers tasked with infiltrating Paradise, and the rest is history. Not that many pins so far, right? Well, there's more! See, after this big twist, the story's tone and setting shifts almost entirely, and the state of affairs becomes thus. Paradise Island is essentially doomed because Marley is coming for them hard after years of intel gathering, having 7 of the 9 Titans on their side, plus new anti-Titan artillery developed by another nation Marley has just subjugated. The characters find out Karl Fritz, the king who fled to Paradise with everyone, had a deterrence plan in order to scare Marley away. He said that if the island were to ever come under attack, he'd unleash the Rumbling, which means releasing all the millions of colossal titans within the walls to trample all over the world. That can only be done with the power of the founding titan. Now, that was meant as an empty threat because Fritz secretly made a vow renouncing war, put a pin on that, preventing his successors, the supposed future inheritors of the founding titan, from ever using this power. However, if someone else that does not have royal blood were to inherit the founding titan, they wouldn't be stuck to this vow. He'd still need to be in contact with some titan that has royal blood in order to activate it though. Oh, how convenient, his half-brother Zeke has royal blood! So, for the last arc of the series, Eren does a full heel turn and begins scheming alongside some other characters to bring about the Rumbling and commit worldwide genocide in order to, supposedly, protect Paradise. Okay, now put a colossal pin on that, pun intended. So by now, you probably already got that each of these pins are the reasons the story has garnered so much controversy. We'll go over them one by one, but first we need some historical context as to why exactly Attack on Titan being branded as fascistic carries some specific connotations and fears regarding the fact that this story is made by a Japanese man for the primary consumption by, well, the country of Japan. The Kojiki, an early Japanese chronicle of its mythologies that will later form the basis for the Shinto religion, states that, in the beginning, the universe was formed by a chaotic, shapeless kind of matter, which slowly evolved into multiple properties that turned into particles and light. The light shone atop the universe as the particles became the first clouds, which later became Takamagahara, the high plane of heaven. The rest of the particles below the clouds formed the earth. Once Takamagahara was formed, 3 kami, the gods in Japanese, appeared. Ame no Minakanushi, Takamimusubi, and Kamimusubi. 7 generations of gods later, there were the couple of Izanami and Izanagi, which were ordered to solidify the shape of the earth, which by then was described as being like floating oil on the primeval ocean. They then formed the archipelago that would be much later known as Japan. Making the islands their home, they marry and procreate many other kami. However, Izanami dies during the birth of Kagutsuchi, the kami of fire. Enraged, Izanagi slays his own newborn son and ventures to Yomi, the underworld, in order to recover his beloved from the land of the dead. He finds her amidst the darkness, her figure hidden by shadows, and pleads for her to return with him. Izanami, however, explains he is too late, as she already ate the food found in Yomi and is thus bound to death. She does say she will ask for permission to leave and asks him to wait. Losing his patience, Izanagi lights a torch to gaze at his wife and finds that his once graceful lover now takes the form of a rotting corpse. Horrified, he runs away from Yomi and the now enraged Izanami, successfully escaping. Feeling tainted by his journey to Yomi, Izanagi finds a river to bathe in, and as he cleans himself, 3 more kami are born from him. Tsukuyomi, the kami of the moon, Susanoo, the kami of the sea, and a bunch of other things, and Amaterasu, the kami of the sun. A lot of things happen after that, giving birth to numerous other kami across generations, but one later point of this narrative is of most importance to this video. I swear I'm going somewhere with this. Amaterasu had a son called Ame no Oshihomimi, which had a son of his own called Ninigi, who was then sent by Amaterasu to the islands of Japan in order to take ownership of the land. Ninigi does as commanded and ends up marrying Konohana Sakuyahime, the kami of all volcanoes. Together, they sire a man called Hori, who then marries Toyotama Hime. They had a son, Ugaya Fukiaizu, who was abandoned by his parents at birth to be raised by his aunt, Tamayorihime. Once the boy came of age, they fell in love and married, siring 4 sons. The last of these, Hikohohodemi, later became known as Emperor Jimmu, the very first emperor of the history of Japan. And this is the religious excuse behind the notion that the Imperial Japanese line is divine, which Imperial Japan used by and large to argue that the Japanese are the superior race and should conquer all of Asia, later on, the world. Similar to the American notion of manifest destiny. See, I was going somewhere with this. Imperial Japan, more specifically the period circa 1931 all the way up to the end of World War II, is a source of a lot of contention. That's the period which gave way to what many call Japanese fascism, and it's pretty easy to see why. That's when the nation began to seriously become militaristic and extreme nationalism ran rampant. The Japanese army began to heavily involve itself with politics under the pretense that it was politically clean and thus one of the only forces capable of fixing the country up. Sadao Araki was pretty much the biggest figurehead for militaristic thinking during this time, and by linking the Bushido Code, the way of the warrior for the samurai, with existing European fascistic ideals, he built what would later be known as Showa nationalism. This, of course, led to a growingly totalitarian government, one where politicians were forbidden from pitting the population against the military or bureaucratic powers, and reinterpretations of other concepts such as kokutai, which roughly translates to national body or structure of state, which this time around was essentially used as a way to justify imperialism via strong propaganda that the Japanese should not only put the nation before the self, but that the imperial line were descendants from Amaterasu herself, and therefore had the divine right to expand and rule the entire world. It all sounds remarkably similar to some other fellas around the world during the same period, doesn't it? It's really no wonder the Japanese Empire allied itself with the Axis. Well, what exactly does that have to do with Attack on Titan? When someone calls the series fascist, this is the context that surrounds it, because Japanese fascism, while not as well known as its Italian counterpart in the West, was and is a real point of contention between Japan and its neighbors. And Japan's stance towards its own history, both politically and on a wider cultural perspective, is concerning. Let's elaborate, though fair warning, things get really dark from now on. During this period, the Japanese Empire began its campaigns to expand its territory and essentially try to conquer the whole of Asia Pacific. This led to a shockingly large litany of war crimes. The number of estimated deaths from these range from 3 to 30 million people. Civilian massacres, sexual slavery, and even human experimentation were perpetrated by the Japanese army. And if you take some time to read through a few of the records and accounts, it's truly chilling, unforgivable stuff. One of the most well-known events that's often brought up when this topic is breached happened during the Second Sino-Japanese War. It's called the Nanjing Massacre, a 6-week-long massacre of the capital of China, which saw the Japanese army let loose and unchecked on the city as soldiers and civilians alike were executed. Women and girls were... I'm not sure if YouTube will punish me for saying the word. I think it's only demonetization, but I don't want to risk a strike, so let's just play it safe and say assaulted en masse, and looting was widespread. It's really hard to wrap your head around the scope and sheer brutality on display. There's a survivor's account about how a Japanese soldier stabbed a pregnant woman in her belly, only to then toss aside the fetus. A general present at the massacre, who was executed for this very war crime, spoke the following of the incident. The Nanjing incident was a terrible disgrace. Immediately after the memorial services, I assembled the higher officers and wept tears of anger before them. As Commander-in-Chief, I told them that after all our efforts to enhance the imperial prestige, everything had been lost in one moment through the brutalities of the soldiers. And can you imagine it? Even after that, these soldiers laughed at me. The Japanese went so far as to allow some of the women in these raids to live in order to become what was commonly called comfort women for the army, and I'm sure you can already guess what role these victims played. Another well-known terrible crime committed against the Chinese during that time was Unit 731. I quite honestly can't find it in me to give you examples in this video. It was a research facility for biochemical weaponry which kidnapped people for abhorrent human experiments. I am not joking when I say I felt like crying just from reading the Wikipedia page. And do you want to know the worst part? It's not even that a great deal of those responsible for such atrocities were never properly punished. It's that to this day, in modern Japan, there's a bunch of people, mostly politicians and historians, making great efforts to deny it ever happened. Now, on the interest of fairness and total intellectual honesty, I will mince no words to describe what I think of these individuals. These people are ghouls, just a bunch of awful assholes who are willing to deny the very real suffering their country once caused on neighboring nations in order to feel better about themselves and their nationalistic feelings, or to pander to equally awful people for votes or popularity in any other form. And this is a cultural problem that bleeds into popular culture as well. Most famously, the late Dragon Quest soundtrack composer Koichi Sugiyama was more than open about his denial of Japanese war crimes, going so far as helping create a committee of historical facts in order to discredit comfort women's accounts about the horrible mistreatment they suffered so that Japan would never need to formally apologize for it or include it on their history educational curriculum. Yoshiyuki Sadamoto, a character designer most famous for his work in Evangelion, went on a full Twitter tirade back in 2019, complaining that the Statue of Peace, a piece of art meant to symbolize and remind people of the suffering endured by Korean comfort women, was a dirty statue of a girl, calling it vulgar and tedious, and a crazy propaganda piece. It's just really, really shitty, and all this is to say that when people criticize Attack on Titan for being fascistic, this is what they mean. This is what they are relating Attack on Titan to, the lens from which they are interpreting the story being told, and, of course, how they cast criticism over its author, Hajime Isayama. Let's talk about him a little bit. Now, ever since the manga's big twist regarding Marley and Eldia, the work has come under suspicion here and there, but to the best of my knowledge, it began to actually reach the popular consciousness with stuff like the following 2019 Polygon article. In this article, oh wow, it's something else, but I'll circle back to that in a little bit when I deal with the pins I said at the beginning of the video. But let's focus on what it says about Isayama. You see, for a few years now, there's been this insistent discourse that Isayama is actually a Japanese imperialist himself, and all of that hinges on two pieces of evidence. The first one is that the character of General Pixis, who's portrayed as a righteous figure within the military of Paradise prior to the twist, is by Isayama's own admission based on Akiyama Yoshifuru, a real general for the Japanese Empire during the First Sino-Japanese War, and went to call the man an admirable figure. People seem to conflate this with him supporting the general's actions. After all, he was responsible for a bunch of war crimes, right? Right? First thing, he says in that same blog post from 2010 that the character of Pixis itself is not really based on Yoshifuru's actual person, just a reference for design. Secondly, while I obviously can't nor want to claim with certainty that Yoshifuru is a saint, even if we assume Isayama really admires this guy on a deeper level, just a little bit of incredibly basic Wikipedia research reveals that he wasn't a particularly problematic figure to begin with. First, he didn't participate in the Second Sino-Japanese War, which is the one where the biggest bulk of war crimes took place. His time in the military predates that. Second, when he retired from the military, he became an educator who would universally influence educational practices in Japan by, and pay attention now, being widely regarded as a leftist because of his open, unambiguous denouncement of conflict. He openly regretted his time serving in the military, taking a very firm stance against embellishing war and militarism, going so far as to avoid showing off his uniform when asked, criticizing the fascistic direction Japan was heading towards in the wake of World War II, and even attempting to reduce and downplay militarism within schools by saying these children are not soldiers. So, even if Isayama particularly thinks this dude was admirable and fixes a character that's framed as righteous and goes against the fascistic Jaegerists, was based on him farther than just appearances, what exactly would be the problem? Of course, none of that information was properly conveyed back when this quote became news, especially not in that Polygon article, whose writer, I believe, didn't read too far down the Wikipedia page. That resulted in Isayama receiving multiple death threats. Terrific. But the second, most damning piece of evidence has to do with this part of the article that states clearly and unambiguously that Isayama himself got into a Twitter flame war, and yes, Elon, I'm still calling it Twitter, in which he downplayed the Nanjing massacre. Now, you see the link on Twitter Flame War right there? That's supposed to be the source. Now let's click on it, shall we? It leads us to a small blog called Musings That Are Seldom, and the post is titled The Possible Disturbing Dissonance Between Hajime Isayama's Beliefs and Attack on Titan's Themes. I'm gonna need to ask you to focus on the possible and dissonance words, please. It goes on to detail how a private Twitter account by the handle of Migi Teorerno got into an argument where they went on the usual platitudes to downplay the role of the Japanese Imperial Army in the occupation of Korea. Pretty shitty stuff. By now, you must be wondering, well, how do they know I'll just call him Migi from now on. How do they know Migi is Isayama? Here's the evidence this blog, which I remind you was used as a source for an article on a professional publication to back up a categorical claim, offers. Apparently, Migi sometimes mentioned seeing some movies around the same time Isayama wrote about them on his official blog. Why anyone would update both an official and out account with the same personal and trivial things is beyond me. Second, apparently, there are some conversations on 2chan, the original 4chan, which is all Japanese, where the users talk to Migi as if they are indeed Isayama. Because, you know, if there's one place on the internet we should all collectively place our trust in and take completely seriously, it's the Chan image boards. Third, apparently Migi follows a bunch of other accounts that are tangentially related to Isayama's work or supposed associates, all investigated by one dude on the internet who feels guilty over spreading the rumor on Tumblr and wants to get to the bottom of it, finding more and more people Migi follows who he links to or sometimes flat out theorizes to be people Isayama should know. This brave Twitter sleuth's conclusion? It's unclear if Migi is indeed Isayama, but he personally believes he is. Do I need to explain to you why none of this comes even close to being concrete or even strong evidence of anything? Heck, the blogger himself states on his post that Migi being Isayama is only a possibility and that they find it weird if true because the story of Attack on Titan explicitly contradicts Migi's expressed views. But that didn't stop Polygon from not only linking this as a source, but to not even mention the claim they make on their article is based on dubious information. Again, just terrific journalism. For Isayama's part, as far as I can tell, he's not a very public figure and he does interview sparsely, so essentially he stayed away from commenting on controversies, which to be fair, I assume came mostly from overseas for better or worse. That doesn't stop people from assuming he said the things Migi said on that tweet on actual interviews though. However, in a recent actual interview of note to the French outlet Inter, when asked about the whole controversial nature of Eren's character, Isayama had this to say: "I'm more of an optimist, and I think that, human beings, we form ourselves by making mistakes. I thought a perfect hero wouldn't be interesting. This character reflects the bad part of me, and the whole story is about killing those bad parts of me." I think this is a pretty candid and risky response to give, given what we are about to cover in this video. Okay, let's finally go over those pins, shall we? First one, the nationalism. Yes, ever since Attack on Titan's first episode, there's been nationalistic vibes going on. The entire nation of Paradise is made of people who live their lives without a care in the world, not concerned over the fact they live in walls, until a giant Titan appears and destroys said walls. A lot of people are very keen on interpreting this as symbolism for xenophobia, with Paradise, which is later revealed to be an island, to be the Japan stand-in and the Titans the dirty, ugly, dangerous foreigners. There is some credit to that take, considering Isayama has stated one of his inspirations for the story, alongside Muv-Love, you could watch that one later if you like, was an encounter he had with an angry foreigner at an internet cafe in Japan. He described the episode as harrowing since he couldn't communicate with the individual in order to try to de-escalate the situation. Given Isayama said this story is about killing the bad parts of himself, xenophobia could be a part of it. And let's not kid ourselves, anyone who's ever been to Japan or has done some research on it knows that low-key xenophobia is, unfortunately, an insidious part of their culture due to a multitude of factors. In any case, if that was the whole point of Attack on Titan, we most certainly wouldn't have anything regarding its post-twist content. You see, Attack on Titan is very much concerned with racism, more specifically, the insidious cycle of hate and violence that's justified by racism. The Eldians are a race of people that, due to its empire's past actions, are reviled the world over and treated horribly by Marley, the current expansionist nation that was once subjugated to them. They are literally called devils, and the Eldians born in Marley are raised to believe they deserve to be treated as such, all because of their ancestors and, more to the point, the remaining ones that fled to Paradise who were certainly plotting an attack against the world. These Eldians are incentivized to climb through the social strata by being promised to become honorary Marleyans by excelling in their military training and inheriting one of the 7 special Titans, where they can be used in special ops against not only Paradise, but other nations around the world Marley wishes to conquer. Enter the character of Gabby Brown, cousin of Reiner, an Eldian steadfastly obsessed with the idea of becoming an honorary Marleyan, not only to provide more comfort for her family, but because she has drunk the Marleyan Kool-Aid and outright despises her own kind for being so cruel to the entire world that it has resulted in her miserable situation. Reiner has been to Paradise, and he knows the truth. The people there are not monsters, they are simply people, living their lives the best they can.
いろんな奴らって何？悪い奴らでしょ。
そうだよガビ。島にいるのは世界を地獄にした悪魔だ。いつまた強大な巨人で世界を踏み潰し進撃してくるかわからない。それを阻止するのは私たち善良なエルディア人でなくてはならない。
Well, she does end up in Paradise and is constantly confronted with the reality that, in the words repeated almost constantly through the anime, they are not the monsters they expected. They're just people. People who lost their loved ones to the Titans. People who lost their loved ones to her. People who are afraid and have just now realized they are perceived as devils by a whole outside world who's openly hostile to them. Her entire arc is about challenging her preconceptions and realizing the world is not black and white, and that she is one of the real victims in this cycle of war and despair. The young. It's the young, born into a cycle of hatred, that are groomed by the society around them to hate the other party and perpetuate the same violence they have been subject to. And what's one of the key instruments the story argues is used to feed into the cycle? Nationalism. Blind love and devotion to your nation. Marleyans believe they are in the right to have Eldian slaves. After all, they were enslaved by them. Marleyans believe they should greedily expand their own empire because they were the ones that sacrificed the most in order to fight Eldia. In the same vein, the Jaegerists are clearly a fascistic movement using nationalism as an excuse to tip the scales and become the glorious empire they once were, trampling on the whole world with the excuse they are defending themselves from those who'd seek to harm them, all the while spouting pride in their nation and ancestry. Attack on Titan openly, unambiguously, some would say even heavy-handedly, subverts the notion of nationalism and offers a scathing critique of it. Next being the Jewish imagery. As you can see from the footage on your screen, the Eldians wear armbands to distinguish themselves from Marleyans, which is obviously very reminiscent of the armbands the Jewish wore on concentration camps during World War II. This has, of course, been used to argue that Attack on Titan is being anti-Semitic, as not only are the race in question able to transform into giant monsters, but they are canonically stated to have dominated the whole world for a time. Plus, remember that Polygon article? It makes that connection by, among other things, and I shit you not, stating that Titans have large noses. Okay, where do I start with this? First of all, I would like to remind everyone that visual shorthands are a thing. Isayama using this particular symbol does not necessarily mean it's a commentary on Jewish ancestry itself, but that it's an easily recognizable visual shorthand for the idea of brutal oppression. It is incredibly unlikely that this is somehow an anti-Semitic commentary because A, the Jewish are not a big topic in Japan, and it barely was of interest to them even back in World War II. There were recorded instances of anti-Semitism during that time, they were allied to the Axis after all, but it was a really minor thing in Japan's history and zeitgeist all things considered. Heck, Japan was even considered a safe refuge from the Holocaust despite being allied to Germany.
The Japanese actually did not send Jews back to Europe to the camps. They were asked to do so by the Nazis, but did not.
And B, let's be frank here, are the Eldians a stand-in for the Japanese or for the Jews? It can't be both. If this story is meant to be fascistic as many believe, then what sense does it make for the Eldians, the ones segregated and oppressed by the evil foreigners, to be also the race that deserves to be punished actually? With all that said, I will concede I'm not Jewish, so I can't exactly say you're all overreacting over nothing. I can at least understand the knee-jerk reaction. The Holocaust is still a very recent wound in our entire world, and current times are full of crazy, anti-Semitic individuals and organizations who are getting all the more emboldened by ever more extreme political movements gaining traction all over the world. It's scary, so of course people are going to be wary. And thus, I actually agree with the criticism Attack on Titan gets for this artistic choice. Shorthand or not, it is at the very least a choice made in bad taste, not out of malice, but out of aloofness. Next being the vow-renouncing war. I'd say this one is rather straightforward with its real-world counterpart. After losing World War II, Japan went on to be occupied by the US, which, among other things, like taking pictures with then-Emperor and war criminal Hirohito to show he was very much not mighty nor divine, pressured for democratization of the country, you know, as the US is very fond of doing around the world, and the creation of what is known now as the Article 9 of the Japanese Constitution, which is a clause outlawing war as a means of solving disputes internationally. What that means in practice is that Japan, by its own constitution, is forbidden from having full-on armed forces, and also they can't engage in any armed disputes their allies may be embroiled in. With the excuse Japan should at least have the right for defending itself should the need arise, they created a bunch of organizations that eventually resulted in the modern JSDF. Japanese Self-Defense Forces. Back in 2014, this became a subject of heavy debate and controversy once then Prime Minister Shinzo Abe, notoriously known for historic revisionism, approved a reinterpretation to the article that included helping out your allies in combat as part of the concept of self-defense. Regardless of your personal feelings on the need of a military power for any country, would you care to hazard a guess as to what the nationalistic, war crime denial weirdos think of Article 9? Yes, they obviously argue Japan not having its own army is a reason for shame and deeply disrespectful to their once glorious nation. So you know, that's the baggage, and that's why the vow-renouncing war plot point has been repeatedly linked to the story being actually nationalistic and having a fascist message, and to be completely fair, it is at the very least a plausible interpretation given the circumstances. The vow-renouncing war was made by the 145th King of Eldia, Karl Fritz, who fled to an island with the remnants of his people and was so ashamed of what his nation had done that he decided they shouldn't use their power even for self-defense, made an empty threat about how they'd unleash the rumbling if Marley ever tried something, wiped his people's memories, and just resigned to the fact Marley would one day day come to destroy it all, but that this brief respite he bought his people would be worth it, and, by his admission, if the fate of the Eldians is to be destroyed by the world they themselves have ravaged, so be it. So, small island, they can't defend themselves, they live in ignorance and are in constant danger. Their king thinks it's okay for them to be wiped out because they committed horrific war crimes. You can interpret this as being a commentary against Article 9. I, of course, reject that notion, because like most of those criticisms that try their hardest to oust Attack on Titan as fascistic, they only work if you analyze this one bit in a bubble and don't take the rest of the story into consideration. Now, to be perfectly clear, I'm not saying Article 9 has nothing to do with it and it's all coincidence. I'm sure that this plot point was inspired by it, keyword being inspired. You see, the thing with Attack on Titan, much like the visual shorthand of the armbands, is that I really don't think much of it is meant to be a direct one-to-one stand-in to any one thing. It takes this particularity of Japan's constitution and implements the idea into the story in order to set the stage for discussion of, does this count as self-defense? Does a nation that committed terrible things have a right to seek peace on its own terms? Is peace even possible? Does it even matter who started what, given this never-ending cycle? It's taking inspiration from real life, as art tends to do, in order to comment not on the subject of inspiration itself, but on the broader themes presented by the story. Plus, if the story was indeed making a conscious argument against Article 9 by painting Paradise, which would be the stand-in for Japan itself by this logic, as a poor victim of nefarious foreign powers conspiring for its destruction, then why make it a point to write in your story's lore that said nation did indeed commit war crimes, was deeply corrupt and disgusting since its inception, more on that later, and make the story's villain, more on that later too, be aggressively against the vow. Plus, this interpretation necessarily needs to assume that the end goal of this plot point is to excuse engaging in war. And like I've been saying multiple times, Attack on Titan shows that war is ugly, messy, unfair, dehumanizing, and harrowing instead of romanticizing it. If you look at the whole picture instead of this one bit, it just doesn't hold up to scrutiny, which is the problem with these kinds of arguments. Whew, okay, only one pin left, the colossal one. Yeah, this is gonna be a big one in its own chapter of the video, obviously. Okay, this is easily the biggest point of contention on discourse surrounding the series, so this is the real talk. Eren is the series' protagonist. He starts off as the plucky, spirited young man with a mission to become powerful and defeat the titans that took away his mother and, in his eyes, his freedom. It's at first easy to relate to him as he's clearly traumatized and hell-bent on defeating those weird-looking things that eat people alive. But then, the big twist happens, and Eren learns the rest of the world hates his kind with a passion. The current superpower is coming for them. He's related to one of the most annoying titans which killed a bunch of his friends, and that his own nation committed horrific war crimes that led to this shitty situation. His solution to the problem at hand? Murder the entire rest of the world in order to protect his friends. If said like that, it makes it sound like Eren had no choice, right? He was pushed into a corner and took the only available choice to save himself and the people he cared about. The story would be thus advocating for genocide as some sort of extreme self-defense method. Of course, this is not true, and Attack on Titan is pretty clear on that. This interpretation only works without analyzing the context surrounding it. So let's go over said context and how Attack on Titan subverts our expectations by showing that Eren was never, in fact, a good guy, but a scary, obsessive monster. Let's start by hammering home what I believe to be one of the main themes of this story, the cycle of war. Remember way back in the video when I mentioned someone named Ymir was blessed with the power of Titans and spread it to her people? Here's what really happened. Ymir was only a small girl living on a village 2,000 years prior to the beginning of the story. Even back then, Eldia and Marley were at war, and no one really knows the reason why, as it doesn't matter. Her village was raided and enslaved by the Eldian army, having their tongues cut out. One day, some pigs escaped from a pen. Ymir was the one blamed for the incident. Was it her that actually opened the pen? It doesn't matter. What matters is that she was released only to be hunted down for sport as punishment and, by complete chance, entered in contact with a mysterious life form that fused with her and gave birth to the very first Titan. The then king of Eldia saw this as an opportunity and forcibly took Ymir as his concubine, from which he produced offspring with the power of Titans. She was later fed to her 3 daughters, Maria, Rose, and Sheena, the names for each wall in Paradise, who were then forced to continuously reproduce and have each child eat their parent's spine in order to multiply the power of Titans and be able to subjugate not only their rival Marley, but the rest of the entire world. Eventually, Marley got the upper hand, and thus, the status quo we have at the present came into being, and now Paradise is using the same excuse to unleash global genocide. We don't even know why Eldia and Marley were fighting in the first place. We just know they were, since time immemorial. Eldia did something terrible, which in turn fueled Marley's excuses to not only fight back, but doing something terrible and attempting to conquer the world as well. And the ones who ultimately pay the price? The children. The younger generations that are raised to hate their enemies, dehumanize them into monsters that don't deserve respect, only to further perpetuate the cycle with endless excuses for committing cruelty and passing on the blame for all the misery and death that ensues. At the end of the day, who's to blame for war? Attack on Titan posits that it doesn't matter. What matters is that humanity will continue to war, and there will never be an end to this cycle of violence, as younger hands will always end up stained with blood and pass those stains along forever and ever. In this world embroiled by a never-ending feedback loop of war, the Jaeger brothers have their own ideas on how to forcibly stop it. Zeke comes up with a plan to sterilize his race, using the powers of the founding Titan to make Eldians incapable of reproducing so they'd slowly die off alongside the power of Titans, freeing the world from this accursed threat for good. This is obviously not a great or even human solution. Eren is not fond of that approach and uses Zeke to achieve his own. If the whole world will keep perpetuating war, then he will kill the whole world except for his own people. Now, this is obviously not a good solution either. Aside from the obvious ethical issues, what's to say the Eldians left standing wouldn't divide and fight between themselves anyway? Human history shows us that humans need little reason to form in-group out-groups. It's a ridiculous plan, a naive child's idea to desperately try to fix the world. And deep down, Eren knows that. He knows what he's doing is ridiculous, stupid, and cruel. He knows he's doing this not to protect those he cares about, but for himself. There was this scene in the anime that never really sat right with me. It is shown that, back when they were kids, Mikasa was kidnapped by 2 human traffickers and was saved by Eren. Thing is, Eren walked up to the 2 men, knife in hand, and brutally murdered them on the spot. This is not really brought up for most of the rest of the series, which was really weird to me. Like, this kid just killed 2 people like it's nothing and nobody's wary of him for it? Didn't his parents say anything? This just isn't normal. Until we get to episode 79, Memories of the Future. I won't spend too much time on these specifics, but suffice it to say there is a metaphysical component to the Titan's powers, and the circumstances are such that one can sort of observe through time and memories of people. Zeke found out Eren's real plans, and so walks through Grisha's memories with him in order to show how much he's being brainwashed by their nationalist father. What he actually finds out, though, is that Eren was never turned into a maniac. He was one all along.
俺とあんたが同じだと思ってたようだが、間違っている。他人から自由を奪われるくらいなら、俺はそいつから自由を奪う。親父が俺をそうしたわけじゃない。俺は生まれた時からこうだった。
It was then that I had to hand it to Isayama because I think this was a genius move. Because it's by this point you realize the red flags were all there. We just didn't pay any mind because the story was being told from the monster's point of view. Eren is so obsessed with the idea of freedom that it's scary. More than being happy or content in life, he's worried about not being a slave to anyone or anything. Even though life inside the walls pre-Merlian invasion is pretty cushy, he simply can't accept the notion of being imprisoned within an area. He berates Armin as someone who's unable to fight for himself when he's bullied. He calls people not willing to fight the Titans cowards, content with being treated like cattle and unable to take a stand to protect their freedom. By his own admission,
壁の里で人類が生きていると知って俺はがっかりした
because he romanticized the act of exploring the outside world as true freedom. And if it's already explored, then his freedom was taken away from him. He understands what he chooses to do is monstrous. He even mourns people he knows will become his future victims, but he does it anyway. He had other choices, but he simply cannot allow himself to pick any other one, because he is broken.
ついにたどり着いたぞこの景色に
Eren is not meant to be cool. He is not meant to be an aspiration. He's meant to show the ultimate tragedy and misery inflicted by a man who's incapable of growing out from his own demons and childish fantasies. Defined by his trauma, ruled by his rage at the world around him, the man who seeks freedom is a slave to his obsession for it. One of the central arguments for Attack on Titan being fascist is that it doesn't demonize Eren enough. It doesn't make it clear he's supposed to be the villain because he looks cool when he does his heel turn, meaning the author is somehow advocating for worldwide genocide. That Eren is portrayed sympathetically as opposed to antagonistically. To that, I say three things. First, villains looking cool is nothing new. These chaps right here also look cool while being villains and doing terrible things, yet I don't see audiences or critics being particularly confused on who to root for. It's almost as if artists just generally enjoy designing cool shit, even for their villains. Second, the core cast of characters set out to stop Eren at the final arc. It is clear from this moment on that Eren has become the antagonist and must be stopped. And third, yes, there is sympathy in how Eren is portrayed. Like I just said, his circumstances make his characterization and eventual choices understandable to some degree. Yet that doesn't mean audiences engaging in sympathizing with Eren's anger are necessarily doing so because they agree with him. You can sympathize for a villain and still know he's in the wrong. Last I checked, that's actually a feature people praise in fiction writing. When your villain is understandable and developed, the protagonist of his own story has a point that makes us sympathize, etc., etc. Yet this only seems to become a problem for Attack on Titan. This fear that Eren is emblematic of the author's own views and actually meant to be taken at face value. Why is that? Well, part of it is due to political context, like I said. Another part of it is hysteria clout chasing. I'll get into that later. But there is another part that does justify somewhat this kind of concern. I said I was gonna try my best to be fair, right? That, unfortunately, means we now gotta talk about the weirdos who, indeed, align with the character and simply don't seem to get the point. Like I said, Eren is not supposed to be an aspiration, but a cautionary tale. I think that's abundantly clear by how he mistreats his friends, alienates everyone around him, manipulates a bunch of assholes into becoming actual race supremacy fascists in order to pursue his obsession with freedom, has a pathetic breakdown, and gets killed by the end. And yet, a not negligible amount of people unironically agree with Eren. You will see in any sort of discussion about the character online that a significant number of dudes are always in one way or another defending his actions. They'll say stuff like he had no choice, which he definitely did, or it was to protect the people he loved, which it certainly wasn't, or even his only mistake was letting his friends stop him. Like people who actively deny the rest of the cast's actions in order to posit Eren had the right of it. There's fucking hashtags like Team Eren, people tattooing his face post-heel turn, and just all sorts of terrible takes and showings of support for his character meant to be understandable but 100% in the wrong. And that's obviously concerning. People worshipping characters not meant to be worshipped is nothing new, unfortunately. Off the top of my head, I can think of Rick from Rick and Morty, Dr. House from House MD, Walter White from Breaking Bad, and 2019's Joker. These were characters not meant to be deified, but a representation of miserable people either not dealing with their pain and trauma properly or going too far into their actions in search of their goals. But I'd say Eren being subject to that is specifically concerning because, well, the sheer amount of destruction and grief he causes is just not something one should handwave, you know? And in today's political climate, where we've got increasingly emboldened neo-Nazi and white supremacist organizations actually advocating for stuff that could be defined as a form of genocide, well, it's scary so many people seem to completely miss the point of Eren's character in Attack on Titan in general, especially when those red pill types use him as some sort of idol figure of masculinity, which is fucking insane. Unfortunately, for anyone that's been around the anime/manga/Japanese games community for long enough, it doesn't take long to realize it's comprised of a lot of weird, socially awkward young men which have nothing going on in their lives. I'm not even being harsh, I was once one of those too. I eventually outgrew those things in my life, but the sad part is that anime, for whatever reason, becomes this gathering place for a man who didn't. People that can't stop crying about woke agendas or Western politics invading their hobby, treating Japan and their culture as this safe space from stuff they don't like, such as LGBTQ, leftism, and gender stuff, apparently. It's precisely these kinds of people that tend to side with Eren, and that's concerning. And now, we arrive at the million-dollar question. Should the fact that so many people are misconstruing and misinterpreting a piece of media like that be considered the fault and responsibility of its author? In my opinion, fuck no. Sure, we can criticize how the author went about portraying it or whatever, but we can't seriously hold them accountable for every crazy interpretation that may come up from some asshole, because here's the sad fact. People that grossly miss the point will forever exist, no matter what you do. You know the misogynistic and harmful red pills? Well, the name for their movement is a reference to a famous scene in The Matrix where John Wick here has to choose between staying in a false reality, the blue pill, or going into the real world, the red pill. This movie was written and produced by two trans women who later on clarified it was actually an unconscious at the time metaphor for transitioning. And that's still somehow the name and metaphor the alpha males here choose for their misogynistic temper tantrum. If we go by the author's responsibility logic, then we should also hold the Wachowski sisters accountable for not being clear enough on their art and helping create the cesspit of an online community that can and already has caused real harm to men and women alike. Think about it. Does that make any sense to you? In short, no, I don't think the author should be held accountable for the actions of crazy people completely missing the point of their work. There is a very interesting discussion to be had here when it comes to how a figure like Eren becomes so central to these kinds of people, but we shouldn't conflate that with authorial intent. Because that's always what this is about, isn't it? If exploring X theme necessarily means the endorsement of X, I say no to that. Depiction does not equal endorsement, and to me, that should be a self-evident truth. Now, next up, there's actually another pin I didn't name yet. This is another big one. It's the If things have gone according to plan, and they rarely do, this video has been released somewhat shortly after the release of the last episode of the series. I specifically planned that, not just because of YouTube algorithmic reasons, but because I'm an anime only. And despite spoiling myself on the endless discussions for quite a fair bit, because I'm an idiot, I still didn't know exactly how AOT ended. I know it pissed a bunch of people off, and that it apparently proves once and for all how this story sides with Eren. Despite being sure the story couldn't possibly go off the rails this late in the game, I kept thinking, maybe? This doubt kept creeping inside my mind. Maybe the ending really is atrocious and recontextualizes everything. Maybe I'm being stupid and all this work on this very video was for nothing, as the ending will prove me wrong and I'll be left looking like a fool. This fear kept growing in me as the date for the final episode approached, and that's it? That's what the fuss was all about? Okay, let me quickly read the manga's final chapter just to make sure no big changes were made, and seriously? One extended conversation that works to further drive home that one piece of dialogue people lost their shit over? People lost their minds and threw heavy accusations at the fans and author because of this? But it's so fucking clear. How could people possibly see it that way? It's ridiculous. Preposterous. No, I can't do that. I said I never do it. I never become the raging white guy YouTuber over media. But people are so... Sorry about that. Let's break this finale down, shall we? First things first, it's worth mentioning the English version most fans were familiar with back in the day the manga ended was fan-translated, which had a few big mistranslations that failed to convey the nuances of the scene properly, which I suppose understandably made people draw the wrong conclusions more easily. I will concede the manga version of events feels more rushed and as such wonkier than the anime version. However, it bears mentioning Isayama was involved in the production of this last episode, so it's safe to assume these changes are essentially him clearing the air a little bit. So, the core cast of characters has finally reached Eren in order to stop the rumbling and, well, a bunch of stuff happens. This video is already way too long, so let's say some fucking great action set pieces go about, and circumstances are thus that Armin finds himself stuck in the Paths, a supernatural landscape provided by the power of Titans, talking with Zeke, who is stuck as well since Eren one-upped him a few episodes back in order to start the apocalypse. In one of my favorite parts of the finale, they have a frank conversation about the nature and meaning of struggling to survive, with Zeke being a nihilist who no longer sees the point in fighting for a better future, and Armin insisting there is meaning in striving for peace, their talk culminating in the conclusion that even if clinging to life is hopeless and will eventually lead to suffering and death, there is meaning and genuine happiness in experiencing and fighting to preserve the right to have small, mundane moments in life. Even if everything is meaningless and ephemeral, those moments matter and are precious enough in order to cling to. This finally convinces Zeke to try and stop this madness, and through his power of royal blood, he manages to stop the rumbling before accepting his very much deserved demise. Eren, however, is still alive and moving, and even survives a huge explosion, making the situation all the more dire. We then cut back to a dream sequence, which has Armin and Eren having an honest heart-to-heart about everything that has happened and is yet to happen. See, the founding titan kinda has time-traveling powers. This is the same sequence in the manga that generated a lot of heated discussion because Armin, at the end, thanks Eren for committing genocide, and the messaging is that Eren did all he did for his friends. Except this didn't happen. That's not what the scene is saying. In the manga, it's a bit more rushed, and in the anime, it's given a few more lines and more room to breathe, but the actual content and subtext is pretty much the same. Armin pushes Eren to explain his reasoning behind all he did, why he decided to unleash global genocide on the world. At first, Eren goes through the usual excuses that he had no choice since time is locked in place, and that he did it because he planned to become the villain who would be defeated by his friends, thus turning them into heroes that would stop the war. Armin does not accept this rationality. It was not his choice to make, nor do they have any notions of having the part of heroes thrust upon them. And none of this is certainly worth 80% of the world's population being decimated.
バカなことをもう取り返しがつかないのかありえないこんなのは解決じゃない人がいなきゃ戦争は起きないだとこんな冗談を真に受けるやつがあるか
Eren gradually breaks his facade and shows his true colors, that of a pathetic, scared, and angry young man who was only playing the part of a stoic edgelord. By his own admission,
どうしてこうなったのかやっとわかった。バカだからだ。どこにでもいるありふれたバカが力を持っちまった。だからこんな結末を迎えることしかできなかった。
he even knows from glancing into the future that the conflict will not even end after all he's done. When pressed again for his reasons, Eren can't even articulate why he did what he did.
なんでかわからねえけど、やりたかったんだ。どうしても。
Armin then finally understands the core of this tragedy. Eren was nothing more than another immature human whose childish dreams of freedom spiraled out of control due to the ruthless and cruel nature of the world around him. He then thanks Eren for showing this visage, a barren wasteland of blood and gore, the visage he thought was freedom, the visage he was working towards all along, because this is finally enough for Armin to grow out of his own naive innocence and realize peace is hard fought, but worth it in the end. He is comforting his pathetic mess of a friend, accepting the responsibility for his own part in this. He is the one that put the impossible dream of freedom into Eren's head, and his own hands are stained with blood from the war, and vowing to fight for a better future, to then meet Eren in hell, if it exists, because that's where both of them belong. This is a nuanced scene that's really powerful, sad, and hopeful at the same time, and is in no way, shape, or form advocating for genocide. In the manga, it's not as fleshed out, but notice how here, after thanking Eren, Armin vows to not let his mistake be in vain. Back in the real world, Mikasa is finally able to muster the courage to kill Eren once and for all. Despite loving him, she finally confronts the fact her love for this man is not worth the insanity he has wrought unto the world. They stop the rumbling, and Titans are no more, but there's still work to be done. The rest of the world is still afraid of what has just happened. And back in Paradise, the Jaegerist movement has only gotten stronger, saying they should still fight the outside world and win their glory back. They chant, they must fight, fight, and fight. In Japanese, tatakai, tatakai, tatakai. Attack on Titan fans, I want you to understand this is meant to show how the cycle of violence will keep on going, and when you chant tatakai, this is what you're associating with. The story is telling you not to tatakai, damn it! Time passes, and Armin, true to his word and alongside his friends, is advocating for peace for everyone who still wishes to war.
散々殺し合った者同士がどうしてパラディ島に現れ平和を訴えるのかその全てを話そう
The credits show the far future, in which humans keep fighting each other even in a world without titans, further driving home the obvious message about how the cycles of war are unfortunately inevitable. In the post-credits, after about who knows how many years and cycles of violence, a young boy and a dog walk together into the same tree Ymir once fell into when being chased by dogs, showing that despite everything, at least something is a little better. I love this ending. I totally understand why someone wouldn't jive with it because it is a bit anticlimactic, and the fact that we know war still rages on can feel like a wet blanket over its pacifist and hopeful messaging. But to me, that's what Attack on Titan is about. It's about human folly, and it's also about hope. It doesn't shy away from showing how hope alone won't change human nature. But it's also brave enough to state the very simple hope of one day coming to mutual understanding is enough to endure life for. It's about taking the bad parts of you, the parts that tell you to give up hope for the future and bettering yourself, and killing them. In any case, I want to stress that, again, this is all my opinion, but one I feel strongly about for the reasons I gave. However, after all of this, there's still one group of people I want to criticize regarding this whole affair. Since I haven't minced any words with many others already, I think it's only fair I don't mince it for all of the pundits, critics, content creators, and the like who keep peddling this notion that Attack on Titan is actually a nefarious and dangerous piece of media. This is a completely manufactured, highly exaggerated narrative created mostly by clout chasers who wish to be the ones to find fault in the current very popular thing, virtue signaling and assuming things about its creator and the fans in order to pat themselves on the back for fighting fascism through assumptions and a bunch of mean-spirited theorizing. And the frustrating part is that this tactic unfortunately works. I've met more than one person who came up to me and said something like, "I liked Attack on Titan, but then I saw it was actually fascist and didn't watch further." It taps into that social phenomenon of creating peer pressure by the notion that this is the new problematic piece of media, and if you like it, you're engaging with it wrong, or you're actually a fascist, or a racist, or a genocidal maniac, or at the very least, an accomplice to such things. As this narrative gains traction, I've begun to see people being wary of talking about it. Content creators that praised it suddenly not mentioning it again, even in passing, I assume afraid of becoming part of this controversy. And that really grinds my gears because my feelings towards how good this series is aside, it's pretty fucking clear in its messaging. People shouldn't be afraid of enjoying it. Attack on Titan is actually very vulnerable for this sort of bad faith narrative because, well, it isn't simple. It may be clear, but it's not a simple story. There's a reason why this video is so freaking long, besides the fact I'm apparently incapable of being concise. So many elements of its plot, characters, and imagery can be taken out of context and turned into a controversy, so in order to be thorough, you have to answer each one. If you analyze any one bit of it in a bubble, you can arrive at any sort of outlandish conclusion while sounding convincing. The armbands and the Titans means it's anti-Semitic propaganda. The nationalistic vibes means it's imperialistic. Eren having abs and being sympathetic to some degree means it advocates for war crimes, and so on and so forth. Every single one of these claims only works in a vacuum. When you conveniently disregard the rest of the context and unsubtle fucking monologues the story has in droves, it lends itself to discussion on its themes, characters, and messages. I just really wish these discussions wouldn't evolve so quickly into, "It's wrong to like this, the author is apparently a fascist and so is problematic," because, in my honest opinion, Attack on Titan does not deserve this bullheaded treatment by a long shot. You don't have to like Attack on Titan. You don't have to be on board with all of its artistic choices or imagery. I'm not arguing any of this elitist stuff. But you should, at the very least, engage with it earnestly and maybe, check some of the claims that are going around, especially when it relates to the author. So try to take a step back, look at the big picture, and hopefully enjoy the ride. Okay, so that was a doozy. I can tell from the word count alone this is going to be a massive video. I wonder how many people will even bother watching it through to the end, so if you're here, thank you for indulging me, giving me some of your time and listening to what I had to say in earnest. consider liking and subscribing, and if you like this one, maybe check out my previous videos. Anyway, that's it from me on this thorny topic, and I'll see you next time, and bye!